we are very happy to have Gracie Willis and Danica Taylor. Yes, so I even remember their names, which is close to a miracle. With us, they are both student attorneys from the University of Michigan Law School Human Trafficking Clinic, and they were. Gracie was able to visit us at our adult group meeting a few months ago. It was a really interesting conversation, and so we asked them both to come to us today to talk about human trafficking in the world and also about Michigan, because we think that living in Michigan, of course, that couldn't possibly happen here, but it does. And so we think that it's very important that we have this conversation. So if we could be as attentive as possible, I will turn over the floor now to the ladies, and thank you very much for coming.
First of all, thank you all so much for having us here, for welcoming us, and sharing your food with us.
Yeah, especially for feeding us. We're in the middle of exams right now, so the food is very welcome.
Thank you so much.
My name is Gracie Willis. I am in my final year of law school. As Father Gregory said, we are from the Human Trafficking Clinic at the University of Michigan Law School.
I'm Danica Taylor. I'm also, like Gracie, in my last semester of law school, 2 weeks until graduation. We have both been working at the clinic for about 2 years, providing legal services to victims of human trafficking.
So when we talk about doing work in the clinic, what we're talking about is representation of victims of human trafficking. So we're providing comprehensive legal services. So what that means is providing immigration, representation, doing family law, custody, public benefits. So victims of human trafficking are often entitled to benefits that they're not aware of. So we help either obtain those benefits or connect them with someone who can help them get those benefits. We do post-adjudication criminal relief. So a lot of times victims of human trafficking have a criminal record that reflects some of the things they may have done while they were being victimized. And what we help them do is clear those criminal records so that those things aren't on their record at no fault of their own. We also do some tax and identity protection representation for the victims. We currently have about 60 clients, and we represent regardless of the type of victimization, regardless of gender, and regardless of age or nationality. So we have foreign nationals, we have U.S. citizens, you name it, we have a client who represents that, some immigration or citizenship. We also participate in advocacy at the state, national, and international levels. We have been, the clinic has been providing advisory information to the state government for the new human trafficking bills that have recently come out. Danica and I actually are both supervisors for a project that catalogs human trafficking cases for the United Nations. So they have a database, and the students in our group go through those cases and tell the United Nations which of these are trafficking and which aren't for an inclusion in that database. We advise legislators on best practices, so provide advice in that way. We run pilot projects for clinics in Mexico, in Washtenaw County, and a new one in Ethiopia. And we also, the clinic is a member of the Michigan Human Trafficking Task Force.
In terms of the scope of human trafficking, a lot of people want to know statistics. But the problem is that we don't really have a lot of statistics we can give you. One of these reasons is a lot of victims of human trafficking don't self-identify as victims of human trafficking. So a lot of the clients that we have in our clinic, they don't hear the term human trafficking until we tell it to them, until we are the ones who said, we listened to your story, you are a victim of human trafficking. And a lot of victims don't report, so there are a lot of victims out there that we're unaware of. In terms of whether human trafficking is a growing problem, we don't know that that's necessarily the case. There's a national human trafficking hotline that people are able to call and report tips, ask questions about, and the number of cases that hotline has received has grown in the past 5 or 6 years. But we think that's just because people are becoming more aware of the issue, not necessarily because the crime has started to grow or increase. And then also, like Gracie said, human trafficking happens right here in Michigan. We're from Ann Arbor. We have clients who are trafficked in Ann Arbor. We have clients from Ypsilanti, the neighboring town, Dexter, Bloomfield Hills. We have a lot of clients in the Metro Detroit area. So really, all parts of Michigan, we're finding clients. And then our clients also come from all parts of the world as well. We have clients from 5 continents. Just me personally, I think I've represented clients from the U.S., the Philippines, Nicaragua, Nigeria, Mexico, Costa Rica, Togo. So they really do come from all over the place. Tajikistan, that's another country. So we have victims who come from everywhere, and because of that, they have a wide variety of legal needs.
I had a large set of clients from Ukraine who were all found at the same time and needed legal assistance, all starting about 5 years ago. So in the clinic, we operate under the federal definition for human trafficking. So we've been telling you a lot about kind of the scope of human trafficking, and now we can kind of zero in on what is human trafficking. Typically, there are 2 prongs that we think of in human trafficking. One is labor-related and one is sex-related. So the labor-related prong is defined as using force, fraud, or coercion to recruit, harbor, transport, or obtain a person for the purpose of labor or services and involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. It's like a lot of words, and a lot of them are not defined in the statute, so we have to do some creative lawyering sometimes to figure out where people are going to fit if we find them to be victims. How do we define peonage? How do we define slavery? Those are all things that we figure out in the clinic. Victims can be found in domestic situations, whether that's nannies or maids. They can be found in sweatshops and factories, janitorial jobs, construction sites, farm work, restaurants, panhandling. Any segment of labor, there is the opportunity for somebody to be exploited as a trafficking victim. In the sex trafficking prong, we have a requirement that under the federal definition, if somebody's under the age of 18, there's no requirement that they've been under force, fraud, or coercion in the acts that they've performed. So any minor, any child will have been found to be a victim of sex trafficking, regardless of whether they've been forced or induced by fraud or coercion.
And so, like Gracie said, when we're looking at the definition of trafficking to sort of make it easier for us when we get a client to try and decide whether or not this person is a victim of human trafficking, we're looking at 3 things mainly. We're looking at a process, a means, and an ends. So for the process, we're looking at whether someone has been recruited, harbored, transported, or obtained. So those are all ors. So when we think of trafficking, we often think of movement because of the word trafficking. But someone can be a victim of trafficking and have never left the house they were born into. Doesn't require any movement, no crossing of national state borders, no problem at all. Also, in terms of the process, harboring. So that's such an easy term to use. Someone just, like, I can harbor Gracie in my house. If I keep her in my house and force her to do something, that's human trafficking. In terms of means, we just need to show force or fraud or coercion. So we don't need to show physical force. A lot of times the psychological coercion is much more powerful than the physical force. And then the ends, like we said, we have either commercial sex, which is only one part of trafficking, and then we have all these other terms: slavery, debt bondage, voluntary servitude.
Does anybody have any questions so far? We've given, I think, a lot of vocab words, and maybe does anybody have any questions so far? Yeah, absolutely.
How do clients find you?
Sure, a number of ways. Sometimes we get them through law enforcement. So law enforcement will maybe arrest one individual who is found who they then believe to be a victim of human trafficking, or maybe they'll arrest an individual who is the perpetrator, the trafficker, and they find the victims in that way. The human trafficking hotline is a number that people can call with tips, with any questions, and they often refer clients to us. Sometimes victims do self-identify, and they find us through the hotline, or they'll find our clinic's phone number.
Right. We just had a 14-year-old girl who self-identified and called the human trafficking hotline, which is very rare. She was really just the ideal victim, honestly, because people never self-identify. So she found the hotline number and was able to reach out to us. We also, now that we are working with the Washtenaw County Court, we have we set up sort of a prostitution diversion court, so women who are arrested for prostitution in Washtenaw County are screened for human trafficking, and so then if they're identified as victims, they'll come to us and we'll provide them legal services. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for this very interesting presentation, and I guess you are addressing a crowd that's so diverse, you know, from small children to the very mature adults, and you are, you know, presenting the definition, but I would like to hear more about specific cases, because this is what makes it concrete for us. And for example, what I was wondering about is what's the relationship between trafficking, because trafficking involves kind of moving a person bodily, and just exploitation. So if you clarify that, and maybe with the help of some case presentations. And another aspect is mentioned that it's not necessarily like the legal immigrant, you know, issue. Sometimes human trafficking can be inside the United States. So all these issues are coming up in my mind. So
Yeah, that's perfect. We actually are planning to address every single one of those concerns. So I would, yeah, so we've got it all ready for you.
maybe you can speak up, because I know that in the back people.
Yes.
have a hard
We'll try. Yeah, I tend to speak quieter, so if you can't hear me, please just let me know.
And if I could interject, if everyone else could kind of speak down, like people who are talking right now, I can't see you, but I can hear you. It will make it a lot easier.
So one of the things I do want to say in response is that, and we talked about this a little bit, but I do want to point it out a little more, is that trafficking doesn't actually require transportation. So when we talk about human trafficking, Danica brought up the words recruiting, harboring, moving, or obtaining. So movement is just one of those ors. So while trafficking, and we'll go into this a little more in just a moment, is an exploitation-based crime, movement across borders or even within borders is not a requirement for someone to be a victim of human trafficking.
Okay, so we're gonna go through a couple of things. So if you were to come across someone in the community and you're trying to decide whether or not this is a victim of human trafficking, or if we're telling you someone's a victim of human trafficking and you're thinking, oh, that doesn't really sound like it to me, we're going to go through some questions and unpack why these people are still victims. And then we'll go through some specific cases of clients that we've worked with, and we'll dive into those issues more. So a lot of people ask, well, what if the victim isn't physically hurt? We have a lot of clients who were never beaten. A lot of times when we see human trafficking, we see it depicted in the media with handcuffs with chains. We don't have any clients who are ever chained to anything. Because why would someone do that when they can use psychological coercion that is just as powerful? They say, if you don't obey me, I'm going to harm your family, I'm going to harm your children. That's really just as powerful. So that one is really big for us. A lot of law enforcement will say, you know, if I don't find them chained to the radiator, they're not a victim. But the reality is we have over 100 clients, none of them have ever been chained to a radiator.
And Danica and I have read a number of cases through our databasing project, and we've never seen a case where there's been handcuffing of any.
There is a lot of times physical abuse. Physical abuse is a big thing, but a lot of times it's just psychological.
The restraint is psychological. The second question is, what if the victim can leave? So we sometimes think somebody who's been exploited and coerced psychologically, if they can leave, well then they're not under somebody's control. But when we look at victims, we like to look at the totality of what their victimization looks like, and sometimes that can look like a little bit of freedom. If somebody is being coerced, giving them a little bit of freedom at first is a way to continue to coerce them and manipulate them. So when sometimes victims can leave the home, can leave the side of the trafficker, and they're still under that trafficker's power.
Yep, and then going along with that, we had some clients, there's a CNN clip on some of our clients who were forced to braid hair in hair braiding salons, and they would walk from their home to the hair braiding salon every day. And people see the video and they're like, well, why didn't they leave? Why didn't they tell someone? These women were from Togo. A lot of them didn't speak English. They're dropped off in the middle of, they were in New Jersey. They don't know where to go. We don't know what law enforcement's like back in their country. They may not be people that they can trust. So the woman in this video, she says, I wanted to leave, but I didn't know where to go. I didn't know who I could trust. So that's a big thing. A lot of times the traffickers will play on sort of their vulnerabilities. Another question question, what if the victim took the job voluntarily? So some women, they will agree to prostitution at first. Some women will agree to, work in a strip club, or they'll agree to take the job. Just because you took something voluntarily at first doesn't mean it can't turn into a trafficking situation.
Another question is, what if the victim has performed an illegal act? And that's something I mentioned just a little earlier. Sometimes victims perform illegal acts, whether, whatever they may be, and it's because of their current trafficking situation. So some states have state laws where if an illegal act is performed as a result of victimization, that can be wiped from their record. Some states don't have that law. We have to fight a little harder in that case to convince the court to wipe their record clean of that. But it doesn't change that the victim has been coerced or brought or forced.
And then another question people ask is, what if the victim doesn't feel like a victim at all? We had a case in Ann Arbor that it was a federal case last semester where a victim got on the stand and she said, I wasn't a victim, I chose to do this myself, I chose to sort of get into the sex industry myself. But then as the prosecutor continued to ask her questions, you saw how she was being manipulated. The prosecutor asked, so when you called the police, where were you? She said, well, I was in a dumpster. Did you have shoes on when you were in the dumpster? No, I didn't. Why didn't you have shoes on? Because this man had taken it from me. Had you tried to leave before? Yes, I had tried to leave before, but he wouldn't let me. So a lot of times victims, they don't realize that they're victims, or they think that if they decided to do this one bad act at first, or this one thing that society doesn't consider good at first, that it's okay for other people to treat them poorly. So a lot of times it's us sort of helping the victim realize that what has been done to them is not their fault and it's not okay. But that takes a lot of work sometimes. A lot of victims are really ashamed of what's happened to them, so they don't want to talk about it, and they want to just keep quiet, keep to themselves, and it's sort of an empowerment thing too. Admitting you're a victim is really difficult.
And finally, what we just kind of talked about a little bit, what if the victim never crosses a city, state, or national border? Again, transportation, movement of any kind isn't required as long as there's harboring, obtaining, or which one am I missing? Or recruiting. Any of those, the transportation is not a requirement for to be trafficked.
Yeah. Do you want to go? I guess we sort of did this.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about it because this gets to the issue of the difference between illegal immigration and trafficking. So trafficking, as I've said, is an exploitation-based crime. The point is that the victim in this case has been exploited, has been forced, or through fraud or coercion, made to do one of these things: labor or sex trafficking. Smuggling, human smuggling, where an individual is moved across a border into the United States, is a transportation-based crime. Smuggling can turn into trafficking if, once the individual reaches the United States, they're held and forced to do, oftentimes what happens, they're held and forced to do work, they're held and forced to cook, they're forced to have sex with people in order to obtain their freedom, or in order to pay off a debt from the smuggling. So while smuggling can exist separately from trafficking, smuggling can become trafficking very quickly. I had two clients who this was the case for. They're coming up from Mexico and had paid a cartel to transport them across the border. And once they got to the United States, near Brownsville, Texas, they were told that once they got to the U.S., they would have to have sex with many men in order to pay the debt that they had incurred as a result of the smuggling that had not been a part of that initial contract.
That's a lot. So we're going to talk right now about two cases that are pretty different. The first case I'm going to talk about is about a woman named Jackie. It's not her real name for confidential reasons. I started working with her almost 2 years ago now. She's a 40-year-old U.S. citizen. She's from Michigan. She was outside of the apartment that she was working at one day and ran across a man named Mark. Mark came up and saw that Jackie had a massage board because she was a masseuse. Regular massage therapist, nothing wrong with that. He recognized that and he said, hey, maybe you would like to come work for me. I'm starting to think about starting this new massage business. This might be something that you'd be interested in. I think you'd be really good at it. She says yes, she's looking for a job. She starts working with him, goes up to his condo, and is then held in involuntary servitude for 4 months. She's not allowed to leave the condo or go anywhere else without Mark's consent. Mark forces her to not do the massages she wants to do, but perform massages on, I think we figured out, hundreds of men over 4 months. She had no control over it herself. He beat her, raped her, did really awful things for her for 4 months. She was also isolated from her family. So she has 2 teenage children, and Mark would do all of the communicating between them. So he would send texts from her phone. He would tell her when she was allowed to go see them, and then she always feared, if I tell them something or if I don't do what he says, he's going to harm my children. He knows where they live now. He knows their names, ages, etc. What I think is important for you to know is Jackie had lots of interactions with people in the community while this was happening. She ran into doctors, she ran into dentists. Some of these people sort of contributed to her trafficking. So there was a doctor who actually gave her prescription pills because Mark told him to sort of keep her mental state, make her easier to control. So this doctor came to Mark's apartment. Mark said, I want her to have these pills, and the doctor was a friend of his and said, okay, I wrote the prescription. She went to a dentist's office when he told her to go there. She also was taken to a bank at one point to close down her checking account. So this is like, I don't know, maybe some of you work at banks. This would have been an opportunity. The bank teller saw her with a man that seemed a little strange. She could have called called the national hotline right then and there, or called the police, and that could have ended her trafficking. So it's good to just be aware. She was also taken to a number of hair and nail salons by Mark, but she was never recognized. A lot of times our clients, they're rescued by people in the community. A case that Gracie's going to talk about next is about a teacher who was the one who ended up sort of saving these kids. In the hair braiding case, it only got discovered because a woman got her hair braided by the same girl for 3 years, and every year she asked the girl, how old are you? And the girl told her 18. Can't be 18 for 3 years in a row, so the woman knew something was up. The girl was from Togo. She had been told, when people ask you how old you are, you say that you're 18. She didn't know really what she was saying, so that was how that case got discovered. So it is a lot of cases that come to us, it's because of people in the community who are aware, who know what's going on, and who are willing to do something about it.
Does anybody have any questions about that case or about anything we've talked up to now? All right. I have another case that I'm going to talk about. Danica and I have both worked on this case. It's actually going to its second round of trial next week, on Monday, tomorrow, our opening arguments. This case involves 4 young children from Togo who a family member to 2 of them and a family friend to 2 of the others, who was an adult, came to their families and said, I can bring your kids to the U.S., I can help them have an education, life here in Togo, it's not going to provide them with the opportunities that you want as parents, and the parents all said, yes, absolutely, you're a family friend, we trust you. So he actually took those children to Ghana and created new identities for them, new documents, new ages, new names, and took pictures of all of them and started having them call him Dad. From there, he was able to get them into Ypsilanti and continued with their fake ages and names, and they started attending school in Ann Arbor. And
they would have been in the same schools that your kids would have gone to, sat next to them in class every day for years.
During that time, they would wake up at 4:30. They would have to sit at this breakfast table and study until school started. If they didn't have any work to do, their trafficker would tell them to do it again, just sit at this table. They would go to school, then they would come home, make dinner. They were forced to work and study and be in bed at 9:30. The kind of chores that he was giving them were things like cleaning the bathroom, the kitchen, vacuuming, laundry, cleaning the windows,
cleaning the walls, doing his laundry,
doing his girlfriend's laundry, clearing the
cars.
snow, mowing lawn, all like chores that look pretty innocuous when it's just on their face. But he would also beat them to the point of bleeding. He gave permanent vision damage to one of our clients because he wasn't working correctly. He was lying on the floor. And he would threaten to send them home to Togo if they told their parents. and he would tell or if they told their parents, and he would tell their parents that they were being bad, that anything that the children told their parents over the phone was a lie because they were all just being bad kids. So even if these kids were telling their parents, something's wrong here, the parents were saying no. There's very much like a respect for elders culture. They said, no, this man has brought you to school in the U.S. You need to be respectful of him. He also told the children that he had security cameras in the house to watch them when he was gone. And we actually don't know if that's true or not.
I don't think it's true, but it was enough for them to believe it. And so so he basically had four free maids for years, the way he was treating these kids. And one of the reasons why he brought them over and made their ages younger in a lot of cases was so that he could collect public benefits from them. I don't remember if Gracie said that or not, but you can collect public benefits when you have kids in the U.S., so that's what he was doing. And when the oldest one turned her fake age 18, he made her leave the house.
Without anywhere to go.
Discovered.
How'd they get discovered? So they got discovered by a teacher at the school. So the youngest one, good and bad. So he would first go to his counselor at school, like almost every day for years, and said, "This is what's happening to me." And the counselor kept telling him, "Just wait till you're 18. It's gonna be okay. It's gonna get better." And he's like, "That's easy for you to say," but he's the one who had to go home with the abuse every day. Child Protective Services was called in multiple times on that case, and they would tell the trafficker what the kids had said that it sort of resulted in further abuse. But there was a teacher at the school who was great, who got what was going on. She would let the kids take naps in her classroom. If she saw that they were tired, she would bring them extra food. And eventually she was the one who got the proper authorities involved and got the kids really out of there, of that situation.
So the kids were here on improper paperwork. So the paperwork they had was all under their fake names and ages and under this fake relationship, this fake parental relationship with their trafficker. So the first thing that we did in our clinic was help get them the proper documentation, which is called a T visa for victims of human trafficking. And under that visa, they're eligible for benefits, they're eligible for a work permit, it gives them identity to go to school. It's legal status in the United States from which they're able to apply for permanent status at a later time. And so they were able to continue going to school, and they were recognized as victims of human trafficking in a way that when the case went to its trial the first time, they were able to contribute in what ways they could to the trial.
So you want to have any more questions about that case before we move on?
But where are the kids now?
The kids, they're still around the Ann Arbor area. They're
But with a foster care?
yeah, so all different places. One of them, the youngest one was adopted by a great family. Initially they were taken into foster care, but the foster system did not know how to deal with human trafficking. And this poor foster mom, so the kids were taken to this mom, and the youngest one finally told her, "This is not my name, this is not my age, the man that I was just taken from is not my dad, this is who I really am." This mom didn't know what to do, but she was great. She contacted the appropriate people, and eventually got them to the clinic. So it wasn't until the foster mom brought them to the clinic that we were able to say these were actually victims of human trafficking. So they were all being treated as siblings, even though they weren't siblings. So now one of them's been adopted. He's older now, he just got into college and is doing wonderful. It's been harder for some of the other ones. One of the girls got pregnant because they were being treated like siblings. The two of them had a baby together. They weren't separated in the foster care system, so she's had a really rough time, but is doing well now, has a really cute daughter. The oldest one, they're all trying to move on, but the problem is, this case, it went to federal trial. The trafficker, he was convicted of forced labor, which was great. He got sentenced to 17 years in prison, but then that got reversed on appeal. So the federal judge said, well, child abuse plus chores doesn't equal forced labor, it doesn't equal human trafficking, but they've already been recognized by the U.S. government as victims of human trafficking. They have T visas. We went over the definition. We can tell you exactly how they're victims of human trafficking. But the federal judge, he was like, no, it's just child abuse plus chores. So what the judge was failing to realize is that there is this larger scheme going on. He had probably been on the bench longer than trafficking had been a crime. Trafficking wasn't a crime in the U.S. until 2000. So you have judges who have been on the bench for 30, 40 years. They don't realize that this is even a thing. So when he got the case, it just looked like a bad child abuse situation. He wasn't able to understand the complexities of the case and what was really happening in the recruitment that had happened and the fake IDs. That was really frustrating. So that got overturned, and now they brought, instead of that he would have been deported, the trafficker would have been deported, but now they brought state charges of child abuse. So they're going, the victims all have to retestify again. We're going through the whole cycle all over again right now.
So with the federal judge on appeal, one of the things he said that we were really interested in after he handed down the opinion is that if this, these chores plus this abuse is human trafficking, then what are we going to do about all these parents who kind of just force their kids to do chores, right? Like, kids have hard chores. We don't want to tell parents you can't tell your kids to wash the dishes. But what like Danica said, what the judge didn't see was the larger picture of the fraud that happened, the larger picture of the fact that he was not their parent. He was somebody who held himself out to be their parent through illegal means. There was a larger scheme of psychological torture that was going on with these kids. So there's nothing that we would, as a clinic, advocate for, that all chores are human trafficking because you're harboring a child in your house and you're forcing them to do chores. There's a bigger picture, there's the bigger coercive, manipulative picture that happens and that we look for. Remember, trafficking is an exploitation-based crime, so we look for that exploitation.
Yes.
What about the parents? The parents knew about the fraud, the fake documents, right? But what about the parents? Nothing happened to them?
Right. So it's not clear that the parents actually knew about the fake documents because the trafficker, he had legal status in the U.S., so they thought that the kids were just coming over with them. The parents didn't necessarily know that they were like going by these new names, forced to call him dad. They didn't have that much connection with them. And also, while this was going on, the trafficker is telling the parents these kids are being bad, they're not behaving, so the kids are scared to tell their parents. So they lost a lot of that relationship while it happened.
Was this guy working at
Yes. Yes.
Yes, I know. Actually,
Yeah, he was a tennis coach and he was a janitor at the U of M hospital, so.
he was teaching one of my boys.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
It happens right in the community, so. Yeah. Anyone else have any questions about that case? Yes. Or anything.
About this
That's
case,
okay.
It's more, I'm curious about who are the kind of the more probable target groups who are becoming trafficked
Right.
victims.
That's a great question. So a lot of times it's people who are in vulnerable situations. So runaway kids, people that have past criminal records. The lady that I spoke about earlier, Jackie, she was a felon. So she was already scared of the police, so it made her an easy target. But yeah, a lot of kids who come from broken homes, who have run away, who maybe have addiction problems, those are the kids who are typically easier. Or people who are, from poor socioeconomic status, they're the ones who are more vulnerable.
what we really don't see is what I think, I don't know if the media or movies portray this to be kind of like the nightmare situation, which, good girl from a good home. The movie Taken is kind of the prime example of this. A good girl from a good home goes to a foreign country and is snatched up and is sold into the sex industry. That's really not what we see at all. If that's what we're looking for as the face of human trafficking, we're not going to find it, and we're going to find very few, if any, of those. What we see are a lot of individuals who are already vulnerable, who don't speak the language, who did agree to prostitution at first, and now are feeling coerced into it and feel like they can't reach out to the police because they might also be addicted to drugs. We have a federal trial recently, and the victims were all using crack cocaine, had all agreed to prostitution initially, but fit a victim profile because they had been exploited despite those things. So when we see victims, we really sometimes see what might be considered unsympathetic victims, because they come from places where we usually also try to not think of them.
So it looks like these people not only need help getting out of that situation, but they need a lot of help in recovering their
Yes.
normal lives.
Absolutely.
And I mean, it involves probably lots of, some resources.
Absolutely, sure.
Yeah.
So actually, the woman that I spoke about, Jackie, after she escaped her trafficking, Michigan has what's called crime victim compensation, where victims of crimes are supposed to be eligible to receive money from what's happened to them, but they said she did not fit the definition. She didn't have a physical injury that prevented her from working, so she was not able to collect money. But what I did, and what what we do a lot, we actually go to churches and we'll say, you know, my client right now, she just got out of this situation. She has 2 teenage kids. She's looking for a place to stay. And my campus ministry from back home ended up raising, I think, $1,000 in like 2 nights to provide money for her and another client. So that's where we go, like, that's not why we're here today, but that is what we do in the clinic when we have people who, when they need money to get a medical examination done, or if they need money to cover therapy costs, we reach out to churches and we, you know, explain the stories and explain what's happened to them, and that's where we get a lot of our funding to help the clients.
Yeah, I still think that it's like a one-time contribution helps them maybe linger like a while, but it looks like they are not leaving their vulnerability behind unless they get some maybe professional retraining or something. And this involves lots of resources. You can't just.
Right.
I'm just like thinking about this.
Yeah, it's bad. Oh, go ahead.
I have a client who was trafficked twice and then entered into a relationship that became domestic violence very quickly. And it's exactly like you're saying, she was in a vulnerable position due to childhood trauma and is somebody who is very vulnerable. We didn't encounter her until after the relationship, the domestic violence relationship ended. And then we heard her story and she just kind of was walking us through it and we were saying, oh my gosh, she's been trafficked twice in 5 years. And what we tried to do was get her set up with social workers, with somebody who could provide her with regular therapy, because the vulnerability doesn't leave, you're right, just because the situation, she's been extracted from the situation.
A lot of what we're doing is trying to find the right resources for them so they don't end up back in that situation. We work a lot with law enforcement, we work a lot with social workers. The importance of social workers cannot be overstated in this situation. We try and set them up, make sure they're in the right schools, make sure they're getting proper language skills if they need those. So we do a lot of what most people wouldn't think is legal work, but we have to do this other work to make sure that they're being
social
protected.
work. Yeah. And kind of another follow-up, but real quick. I was wondering, how do those people who are perpetrators, who are, you know, inducing those people into the situation, what does the law do to them? Are they kind of severely punished, or do they just go and find another victim?
It depends. So in our clinic, we've had about 100 clients, open and close cases, and only about 15% of those cases have been prosecuted. 15? Yeah, 15. Not very many. So a lot of prosecutors just don't know what to do with these cases. They've never seen a case like the Tobiabi case. They just don't know when they get it. They don't have the evidence that they would typically have in other cases to support it. But we just had a successful conviction in Arbor last semester. Do you remember what? I don't even know if he's been sentenced yet, but he's going to get a long sentence. He's going to go away for a long time. But Jackie's trafficker, he was actually convicted of sex trafficking back in 2006, spent a couple of years in prison, got out, started the same thing again. So it depends, but now there's a federal law that does have severe penalties for people who are convicted. The state laws differ, but there's the opportunity for them to go to prison for a long time if law enforcement brings the case to the prosecutors, and then if the prosecutors decide to actually prosecute the case.
And one thing that prosecutors look to also in deciding whether or not to try a case, my client who I was just speaking about, who had been trafficked twice, we spoke with a prosecutor who was thinking about trying to try the case, and it was not tried. Charges were never brought. And one of the things that prosecutors look at is this going to be a sympathetic case to a jury? Is a jury going to think that this victim is a victim of this thing, that this person perpetrated this kind of, it's a scary sound, human trafficking. It brings up all sorts of images. And like I said, a lot of the time we have victims that are not sympathetic. So one of the things that we think is beneficial about doing these sorts of community presentations is that it's bringing awareness that if we have a community that knows about this crime, that if you're ever on a jury panel, you're not going to be a juror who says, no, I think that this girl had it coming, or whatever. Prosecutors need to know that the jury that they're going to be speaking to will have sympathy for the victim and will understand that this is a crime that was committed.
Yeah. Yes.
Isn't there some kind of other way to educate the people who actually in power about this? Like, this seems to be silly that,
Right.
just ignore it.
Right. Yes. So it's happening at both the national and the international level. We're trying to educate people about the issue. There is a new trafficking law that may have actually been passed. It was just brought to the Senate. That would sort of expand services to victims. So the knowledge is out there. People are being made more aware. What I found, I spent a semester working at the United Nations, and what I found there is a lot of people who are in those positions of power had never worked with real victims before. So they have these laws that sound really great in theory, but then when you go to put them in practice, they're just not going to work. I think it'll be in 10 years when our clinic and our students who have worked with victims and the people like us are in the position of hopefully better situated to actually enact change. I think we'll start to see better laws. But trafficking was such a new crime. Like I said, 2000 was when it was passed. You have lots of members of Congress who have been there way longer than 2000.
They may be even trafficking too, right?
Right, yeah. Right. Yes. Yes. So that's an issue. Right, and like we see traffickers who have lots of money and who have lots of resources. Lots of diplomats have committed trafficking. So it's not just a poor man's crime. We see lots of the rich people doing it too. So it's getting people interested in the issue and actually getting them to enforce it. But it's getting better, and hopefully we'll continue to get better. Any more questions?